been a minute. Let's talk about some things. Hi, welcome back to the channel. We are now inside, as you can see. This is my lovely abode. I wanted to welcome you in today to talk about some interesting concepts that have been rattling around in my brain as I've been undergoing some theological and philosophical changes recently. And this all has to do with the term evangelical. So what do I mean by that? Well, that's a good question to ask because nobody seems to know what the term evangelical means. Is it a voting block? Is it a description of a group of people in a sociological way? Is it a theological description of people who hold to a certain kind of belief? Well, yes. As I look online, I go to an evangelical school. I see an organization of evangelical Catholics. I see Lutherans calling themselves evangelical Catholics. I see evangelicals for Kamala Harris. And I think, man, if this word can be used in all these contexts, what does it mean? And if it's so broad, then why are we still using it? So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about what is an evangelical, and I want to talk about what kind of terms we might use instead, what kind of terms I might use instead. I'm not sure that I like the word now that I know it. So just a brief historical overview, and I'll put some links in the description of this video with some confirmation of the historical details of this. But basically, as far as I can glean from looking at the various sources I've checked, evangelical today in America means somebody, as Doug Wilson says, who likes Billy Graham. That seems to be a good description. Basically, there was a controversy between fundamentalists and modernists in the early part of the 20th century, and that extended way back into the 19th as well, but it sort of came to the front with J. Gresham Mason's Christianity and Liberalism, which is a great book. You should read it if you haven't, where a lot of the mainline churches became super liberal, denied the resurrection, had a lot of strange beliefs coming from German higher criticism and different schools in Europe. And the response to this was a group of Christian theologians and pastors wanting to emphasize the fundamentals of the faith, the virgin birth, the resurrection of Christ, etc. And so the fundamentalist movement kind of started as sort of a reaffirmation of historic Christianity. It had a very particular kind of tone to it later, became more Baptistic, became more dispensational. And long story short, a lot of the more dispensational Baptist fundamentalists sort of got a reputation for not being very engaged with the culture. They weren't seen as, a fundamentalist is kind of a nasty term if you've ever heard it used on you or heard it used about other people. It's not a nice word. So nobody wanted to call themselves a fundamentalist anymore. And guys like Bob Jones started Bob Jones University. That's a fundamentalist institution. But there, in the middle of the 20th century, there was a movement of theologians who would kind of come from the fundamentalist camp against modernists, and saying, hey, we actually don't really want to identify with fundamentalists anymore. And for a number of reasons, and many of them good. And so they said, hey, here, basically, we still affirm the historic faith. We affirm the fundamentals of the faith. But we want to be more engaged in culture. We're not dispensational. We're not this. We're not that. And so what you have is the founding of the National Association of Evangelicals, and you've got Fuller Seminary founded, and there's kind of this Wheaton College plays a role in this. And in the middle of the 20th century, evangelicalism becomes a thing. Christianity Today is the publication of evangelicalism. This might not be new information for you. You might know about this. I'm just digesting this really quickly. But the things that sort of characterize this group as a whole are obviously an affirmation of historic orthodoxies. So there's no parting ways there with them. There's also Billy Graham gets involved with this whole evangelical movement in the middle of the 20th century, and he's kind of like a figurehead for this. And there's like a big revivalistic kind of experiential undertone to all of this. Evangelicals are people who like to talk about being born again. And by that they mean they had a radical conversion experience or something to that effect. So this is the tenor of it. This is a very Baptistic kind of movement in a lot of ways. There were people who, Machen, who I mentioned earlier, was a Presbyterian, and so he obviously wasn't Baptistic, and he participated in the fundamentalist movement. So it wasn't purely there. But when we think about fundamentalists, and even when we think about evangelicals, we think Baptist. So this is the sort of the framework of that term. Now, in the 70s and sort of onward, you get sort of the emergence of folks like Jerry Falwell, Francis Schaeffer, the sort of moral majority movement in politics, and that turns evangelical into a term about voting bloc. So, again, this is all stuff you might know about this, but for interested people, I'll put resources for you to chase all these things down. And so now evangelical is a term that basically refers to a voting bloc of people who are going to vote pro-life and who are socially conservative. And so it's already losing its meaning. And then there are people now, such as Phil Fisher, who want to keep the title evangelical, but want to be a part of something to the effect of evangelicals for Harris in 2024, which is nutty to me, given the history of this term. But I get to this point in my research, and I'm seeing all this, and a couple of things are sticking out to me. The first is I'm not really a big revivalist guy. I'm not big on. I don't think the second Great Awakening, for sure. I don't know that it was good for American Christianity. It's very Arminian. It's very decisionistic in its theological undertones, and it's very Baptistic. And I'm not a Baptist, so I haven't been for a little over a year now. And so I'm wondering, okay, that kind of makes this term seem like a moot term. Like, why would I use this? The second thing is, politically, evangelicals, there's a lot there's a lot there. The evangelicals have been kind of a bulwark of pro-life movement, and good on them for doing that. I'm a part of that too. I'm very pro-life, and there's something there, but there's also kind of this clinging to sort of the roots of the American founding with Locke. The evangelicalism, in this political sense, is often conflated with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all the good old-fashioned American dream things. It's very American. It's very centered on American ideas about liberality. So it's sort of a classical liberal approach. It's a recovering the Constitution and the founding, and that's all great. But I also have problems with that. I've been consuming a lot of Patrick Deneen. He's a professor at Notre Dame. He wrote a book called Why Liberalism Failed, talking about classical liberalism, not what we would call progressivism. But this idea that of people, the basic sort of foundational motivation for a good or just society is freedom, which is a very American idea. It's very ingrained in all of us. And freedom is often defined in very autonomous terms. I have freedom to do what I want. It's not that I'm freed from sin or vice to do what's righteous, which is the sort of more traditional understanding of freedom, but rather that I'm free to pursue whatever whims I'd like. And as long as I don't hurt anyone is kind of the caveat that people give. And this is, it's less present in the founders the more you go on in the liberal traditions there. But anyway, suffice it to say, Deneen makes the point that liberalism in itself is flawed. It's busted up. It's broken. It doesn't work. And so we need to move beyond it, which is why his movement is called post-liberalism. Now, all of the post-liberals are Catholics, Roman Catholics. And so I'm sitting here sort of nodding my head and agreeing with Patrick Deneen, sort of shaking my head at evangelical voting blocks and sort of, 1776 rah stuff, shaking my head at the Baptistic and revivalistic paradigms there, and then shaking my head at some of the more obvious and obtuse Roman Catholic leanings in the work of somebody like Patrick Deneen. And so there's clearly problems there. I have been in a space where I've sort of affirmed more theocratic beliefs, if you will. I do think that any just society is governed by people that have a religion. religion has something to do with the way that we order our societies. All legislation is legislation of morality, because nobody legislates that which isn't moral. I've gone through the Christian Reconstructionist phase, if you know what that is, and theonomy, and down to the teeth, and I've sort of generally settled. It's in my profile. I'm a grassroots theocrat, and I've come to that understanding. And a lot of what's present in post-liberalism resonates with that, but it's very obviously not evangelical. And so I keep coming to this term. So we're all fighting over this term. It means a lot of different things. Why are we doing that? Why? Is it worth it? Is it worth it to keep the term? And after a lot of thinking about it, I don't think it is. It's not descriptive, really, of much. It's so convoluted that if I describe myself to you as an evangelical sitting down, I had to give you a spiel like what I just did. I had to explain to you a number of theological and political historical points, and most of them have to do with America. And it's just why use a term when it's loaded like that? So now, okay, we're kind of like, oh yeah, we don't like the term evangelical. There's some good things about it that obviously would apply to me. There's some things about it that wouldn't. How do we import these other ideas from post-liberalism into our political thought? Who knows? There's a lot of questions there. Here's my proposed answer, and this is sort of the point of the video. If you're watching, pay attention here. I think that another term is in order, because the people who are comfortable keeping the term evangelical, I think, can have it. And it would help those of us who are maybe not where they are in terms of our attitudes towards revivalism and the sort of individualistic Baptistic Christianity that has become predominant in America. In terms of those of us who are not there with the classical liberalism components that are associated with good old apple pie evangelicalism as a voting bloc, and in terms of those of us who are moving in other directions theologically and politically, we could embrace a new term. And here's my proposed term. And it might sound cringe, and that's why I'm putting it out here, so people can get feedback and answer this question. I propose the term magisterialist or magisterial as a term to encompass some of the guys who are moving away from these Enlightenment kind of rationalistic, individualistic conceptions about faith and baptism, and I say magisterial in reference to the magisterial reformers, Calvin, Luther, Bucer, and Zwingli, and sort of first generation reformers. And I think that's helpful because in a lot of ways the projects that the CREC is trying to undertake, despite the differences in intramural conflicts that are going on, are largely an attempted retrieval of magisterial Protestantism. This is what the Federal Vision controversy is largely about. It's are we going to retrieve a doctrine of baptism and of the covenant that has a heavier emphasis on sacramental efficacy? Are we going to pull ourselves into a more magisterially Protestant way? And this is true theologically. I think it's also true socially and politically. If you read Book 4 of Calvin's Institutes and you read his section on the civil magistrate, you'll very quickly realize that Calvin is not a classical liberal in any sense of that word. Now, can you argue that maybe ideas in Calvin could later come to fruition in Locke? Yeah, you could, and I'm sure that some of the Roman Catholic post-liberal guys in that corner might do that. But on the whole, we can still say that when it comes to the question of politics and religion and sort of combining these terms into some kind of cohesive descriptor of what we are and what we want out of life and culture and society, magisterial is not bad. We don't want to stop at the reformers. Obviously, I don't want to stop at Calvin or Luther, although I do want to go back to them. But we do want to take their ideas and build on them, expand on them in ways that maybe we failed to build and expand on them before. So, describing ourselves instead of as evangelicals as magisterials or magisterialist or post-liberal magisterial, neo-magisterial, we want to avoid the pitfalls of pronouns in bio kind of descriptor language about our positions. I do, at least, where you start adding on theological modifiers to describe your beliefs, and before you know it, you're a post-Bardian, neo-feudalistic, post-liberal, insert rationalistic, neo-hyper special realist, or something like that. You're just saying things for the sake of saying them, and you're not actually giving anybody a clear indication of what you believe. So magisterial seems to me, just hit the nail on the head. We're just trying to retrieve the magisterial Reformation, doctrinally and politically. We want to see a life that's ordered in classical Protestant ways, and that seems like a worthwhile project. And if you don't think it's worthwhile, then you have now a label with which to label your opponents. Look at those magisterial guys. It even has a derogatory sound. This is appealing to both the friends and enemies of CREC-esque projects of retrieval of magisterial doctrine and retrieval of social practices and teachings from the early Reformation. And the magisterial Protestants, in terms of the issue of relating with the Catholics over here in their post-liberal world, the magisterial reformers were not trying to break off from Rome per se. They really wanted to see reform within the true church. They still acknowledged the legitimacy of Rome as a church, as Calvin does, and I'll link to some things below, maybe a video by Gavin Ortland. But it didn't work out. But they weren't opposed to. They weren't so far from Roman Catholics. The drift has happened over time, and so maybe there's some ecumenical dialogue pieces there. There's some points of post-liberalism in the way that Deneen is arguing for it, and the way that guys at New Polity are arguing for it, that I think are helpful. So that's my brain just unloaded on you here. If you didn't catch the drift of that, that's okay. You don't have to know all the ins and outs of this. This is largely warfare over terminology that we use to describe social and ethical and political and theological positions that most people don't think about. I think the point, though, is that most of us are, in sort of my camps, are dissatisfied with the way that the West is turning out, and we want to see real change and revival and reformation. Not revival in the sense of that sort of more Baptistic, revivalistic method, but we want to see a renewal within the church. We want to see liturgical and cultural and biblical renewal. And this seems like a good label. So this video might not be helpful, but I said I'd sit down in front of the camera for these YouTube videos and just talk. And so this is what's on my mind, and so this is what you'll get today. And I hope that you've enjoyed it. At any rate, thanks for watching. God bless you. Bye.